Welcome back to Conflicts of Interest. This is episode 566. I'm the host, Kyle Anzalone, and today joined by co-host Connor Freeman. Connor, how you doing?
I'm doing very well, Kyle. How are you?
Doing very well, Connor. Want to let the audience know that we both made appearances on Judge Napolitano's Judging Freedom this week. So go check that out. They're both in his archive at YouTube on the Judging Freedom channel. Connor was on Wednesday. I was just on before we came on to record this show on Thursday. So be sure to check those out. And really, I mean, one of the most important shows for anti-war viewpoints are realist viewpoints getting out there. So much really good analysis on the hardest hitting issues and the issues hardest to cover. So definitely subscribe to that show if you don't already. And just subscribe to this show as well. It's on YouTube, Rumble, Odysee, anywhere you can listen to podcasts, at con_interest on Twitter. And Connor, let's get into the news today. First up here is one from Dave DeCamp. British general admits UK couldn't fight Russia for more than 2 weeks. This is no surprise. The Brits are actually really struggling to bomb the Houthis. Their ships apparently can't even conduct operations, and so they're relying solely on airstrikes from the Brits there. So a British general admitted on Tuesday that the UK couldn't handle a war with Russia for more than 2 months, as London has significantly depleted its military stockpiles by arming Ukraine. The lieutenant general, and he is the Deputy Chief of Defense Staff, made the comments during a British Parliament hearing where he was urging more military spending. MP Mark Francosis, a member of the Conservative Party, asked the Lieutenant General if it was true that the UK couldn't fight Putin for more than a couple of months in full-on shooting war because we don't have ammunition and reserves of equipment to do it. The general said the statement was true, and then British Defence Minister Grant Shapps was also at the hearing and downplayed the lack of UK military readiness, saying that any war with Russia would be fought alongside NATO allies, and referred to Article 5 of the alliance's treaty that outlines mutual defense commitments. Now, Connor, one problem is if you go outside of the UK, the defense stockpiles and the ammunition stockpiles are not looking much better. In fact, I think this is probably a nice way to transition to our Israel coverage today. In this particular article I wrote for the Libertarian Institute on March 27th, IDF officer says we are demolishing everything before entering. And this article really gets into and discusses the Israeli weapon supply chain. And really, Connor, this means the global weapon supply chain. And it points out that there is a real shortage in primers for artillery rounds. And so these are the chemicals that they put inside of the shells that when they impact, they cause the explosion. They actually cause the explosives to go off, and so these are absolutely a crucial part of being able to fire functioning artillery shells. And there's a global shortage in these particular chemicals. And another factor of what happened was, after, I believe, the Yom Kippur War in 1973, the U.S. left a pretty large stockpiles of weapons in Israel. And it was kind of under this agreement, Connor, where these are U.S. weapons. And so if we ever need them, we could take them. But at the same time, if Israel ever really got in trouble, and since we give Israel all the weapons all the time, these stockpiles will be there for them. And so because of those stockpiles, Israel has pared down their own domestic production abilities for ammunition, for artillery shells. And then when the war in Ukraine started, the U.S. started to dip into these stockpiles. And now you're 6 months after October 7th, and the Israelis have gone through a large portion of their stockpiles. And in fact, they're buying weapons from countries, not the U.S., but countries that make lower quality weapons. And apparently the dud rate is over 15% for the Israeli military using these weapons, which is significant for a number of reasons, Connor. One, whoever is going to inhabit the Strip next, whether Israelis or Palestinians, probably do not want a bunch of unexploded artillery rounds under their feet. And if the Israelis do not plan to fully expel the Palestinians from the Strip, we know from a New York Times article earlier this year that the Palestinians, Hamas, they obtained a lot of their weapons and explosives from spent Israeli bombs that failed to detonate. So bombs that were dropped on Gaza that did detonate, they were taking the explosives out, using them in their tank rounds and things like that. And so if, the landscape of Gaza is now littered with unexploded ordinances, whatever group is in Gaza and in armed resistance to Ukraine, and even if Hamas is completely smashed, obviously there's going to be plenty of people, plenty of young men willing to join an armed resistance after this months-long brutal onslaught that we have seen in Gaza, that they will have plenty of explosives to make into weapons if this continues to go on. So I say all that and make one more quick point before we actually get into the article, and that is, the U.S. should have so much leverage over Israel right now, Connor. They need American weapons so badly that we should be able to really dictate to the Israelis how they're going to wage this war, and we are choosing not to. Of course, we could also completely stop them from waging the genocide at this point by stop giving them weapons, but no chance of that happening. So back to my article here. A senior Israel Defense Forces IDF officer said that Tel Aviv is engaging in an overly wasteful war in Gaza. The soldier went on to estimate that Israelis could have achieved similar results against Hamas with only 10% of the destruction inflicted upon the Strip. Speaking with Haaretz, the IDF officer said the operations were wasteful and that the same objectives could have been accomplished with far less destruction. And this is a quote from him. Our form of combat at the moment is unusually wasteful. You could term it a cruel war of rich people. We're attacking innumerable targets without asking whether it's worth attacking them, and artillery is being used in places where it is not really obligatory. The fact that we are demolishing everything before entering is being manifested in the duration of this operation. If you'd asked before the war how long it would take us to conquer Gaza, I would have been that we were talking about a situation that could be accomplished in far less than 4 months. In principle, it would be possible to achieve similar achievements with 10% of the destruction we have caused. While Tel Aviv does not publish official numbers, some sources told Haaretz that over the past 6 months, Israel has dropped tens of thousands of bombs on the Strip, along with hundreds of thousands of shells that have been fired into the enclave. And I think there was an estimate in this article, Connor, that seemed to combine shells to mean artillery shells. So I think they're talking about hundreds of thousands of artillery shells there. But when you combine artillery shells with tank shells, that number might actually exceed 1.5 million, which would be absolutely horrific. The IDF officer described the amount of munition used in Gaza as unprecedented and critical to the and to critical eyes is wasteful, protracted combat. At least 32,000 Palestinians, including 13,000 children, have been killed by the brutal onslaught. The heavy bombing of Gaza has destroyed most of the infrastructure in the Strip. The Guardian reports the widespread bombing campaign could amount to a form of ethnic cleansing called domicide, which is basically making the entire land inhabitable. The Israeli outlet Plus 972 magazine has also reported on the IDF's widespread bombing campaign. The IDF used an AI program dubbed the Gospel to generate hundreds of targets per day. In an effort to cripple Palestinian society, the IDF is intentionally targeting infrastructure such as banks and universities. The officer claimed the IDF employed the tactics to reduce troop casualties, but questioned the policy's effectiveness. He said, Our assumption is that we have sown less destruction. Our assumption is that if we had sown less destruction, we would have sustained more casualties. On the other hand, however, less destruction would have meant that we were on the ground for far less time, and that means fewer casualties. The officer added, We prefer to apply force powerfully and cruelly over taking risks. So, as Israel has committed to relying on heavy munitions to fight in Gaza, Tel Aviv's arms stockpiles are running short. Tel Aviv relies on Washington for arms. However, Israel has been forced to seek other sources for and fire thousands of munitions with high dud rates. Duds present a problem for Israel, as investigations by the New York Times found most of Hamas's explosives are made from Israeli bombs which failed to detonate. Israel's extensive use of munitions to fight should give the White House increased leverage over Tel Aviv. However, President Biden has refused to condition any U.S. military aid to Israel. Last week, Congress authorized sending the annual $3.8 in military assistance to Tel Aviv as a part of the $1.2 trillion spending package, and of course, there's no conditions on that aid. One last story here before I hand it over to Connor. This one is a follow-up on a story we talked about in the last episode of the show. State Department smears author of UN rights report accusing Israel of genocide as anti-Semitic. So the State Department on Wednesday suggested the author of the UN human rights report that says there are reasonable grounds to believe Israel is committing genocide is anti-Semitic as a way to dismiss the allegations. And this really does sum up what he said. You know, the question was asked, and the spokesperson, Matthew Miller, just said that, you know, she's anti-Semitic. She had previously made statements that he viewed as being too positive of October 7th. And that was the smear against her. Of course, Connor, this is a very thorough report that really goes through and documents that Israel is committing a genocide, not just from the facts on the ground, the rampant destruction, even of civilian targets, the destruction of Gaza's medical infrastructure, and just really crippling the entire society and economy of Gaza, deliberately provoking a famine. On top of all of that, she also includes these statements from the Israeli officials time and time again calling for a genocide. You know, Connor, I really do believe that when history looks back at this moment, some of the defining statements will be the defense minister Gallant's decision and announcement that no food, water, or any kind of aid will enter the Gaza Strip after October 7th. And, you know, people will show that clearly Israel did their best to implement that policy. They will look at him, you know, again, the defense minister, calling Palestinians human animals. They will look at the conferences that were held in Jerusalem, celebrating the plans to resettle Gaza by Israelis, you know, meaning not that they're going to ethnically cleanse the Gaza Strip of Palestinians. And I think most importantly, the real defining statement will be Benjamin Netanyahu's statements on Amalek and how you need to go in and slaughter the Palestinians, and what that really implied in the message that sent to the Israeli soldiers who, you know, Connor, we have just seen time and time again. It's almost brutal to be on X these days, Twitter, because day after day, well, I mean, the good thing that you see day after day is, of course, the crumbling of the power of the word anti-Semite, as so many defenders of Israel have tried to say that if you don't support this genocide, you are anti-Semite, and it's really crumbled the power of that word. The other problem is, though, as you go on there every day, you just see horrific words crimes that you know are only being committed because Israel is backed by the U.S. and because our tax dollars, you know, everything that we do in this country and all the arms that we produce, a good number of those are going to Israel to slaughter the Palestinians. And so when some drone tracks down 4 young Palestinians and slaughters them all, and then, you know, when 1 or the 2 of the wounded try to limp away, they pit them off as well. There's a video, Connor, of a couple young Palestinian men walking on a beach, and, you know, I think they are described as youth, so they could have been teenagers or something like that, clearly unarmed, clearly waving white flags, gunned down by the Israeli military. But not only that, not only did they gun them down, they didn't take their bodies, Connor, put them in body beds and, you know, try to get them to some kind of Palestinian authorities so they could have a decent burial and maybe their family members will know what happened to them. No, they took a bulldozer and seemed to have drugged the bodies, and anybody who's, you know, used or been around heavy equipment will understand that, you know, dragging a body with a heavy equipment like that is probably going to really mess it up. And so, you know, desecrating the bodies of these young men and then just putting them under a small pile of rubble on the beach in Gaza somewhere. Again, their families will probably never know what happened to them. It's just, it's so horrific, and it's so frequent, and it's so in your face that the American people are largely done with this. And Connor, I think you got some news on that.
Yeah, absolutely. This is very encouraging, as well as several polls that have been taken since the war started have been. indicating that, as you say, the American people are fed up with these atrocities being carried out with their money and in their name. So Dave DeCamp wrote this piece for antiwar.com on yesterday on the 27th. Poll: majority of Americans disapprove of Israel's military actions in Gaza. So a new Gallup poll has found that a majority of Americans disapprove of Israel's military actions in Gaza, which have killed more than 32,000 Palestinians, including over 13,000 children, and has put the entire population of the Strip on the brink of famine. Asked if they approve or disapprove of Israel's military actions, 55% of respondents said that they disapproved, while only 36% said that they approved of the onslaught. So disapproval of Israel has risen as Gallup asked the same question in a poll that was released in November of last year, which found 50% of respondents approved of Israel's military campaign, while 45% disapproved. So favorability for Israel is predictably strongest among Republicans, with 64% approving Israel's assault on Gaza in the latest poll. Only 29% of independents and 18% of Democrats said that they approved of the Israeli campaign. Again, this does not bode well for Joe Biden's chances at re-election here in November. As you've discussed multiple times, Colin, written up for us at the Institute, 50% of people who voted for Biden in 2020 now believe he's complicit in genocide, the worst crime a human being or group of human beings could commit against anybody else. And he's losing to, young people, or losing to Trump among key demographics that the Democrats always assume they have locked up, whether that's young people, African Americans, Hispanics. So they're really taking a big hit here. And the Israeli campaign in Gaza, the genocidal ethnic cleansing effort, is playing a huge role in this. And so since October 7th, polling has consistently shown that a majority of American voters who favor a ceasefire in Gaza do favor a ceasefire in Gaza. So one of the most important examples of this is the Data for Progress poll from February that shows 67%. So two-thirds, or actually more than two-thirds of Americans favor the U.S. pushing for a permanent ceasefire in Gaza. And that includes 77% of Democrats, 69% of independents, and a staggering 56% of Republicans. So the Biden administration has consistently opposed the idea of a ceasefire in Gaza unless it's linked to a hostage deal. But even in that case, both the U.S. and Israel say that any truce would be temporary and would have to be rejected Hamas's offer to negotiate a permanent ceasefire. Because, of course, why would you negotiate a permanent ceasefire and disengage from Gaza, pull the troops out, and allow all this humanitarian aid that we can't even fathom really how much needs to get in at this point? Previously, when the blockade was imposed and before the war had started, the Gazans were getting about 500 trucks sent in daily of aid and medicine and food and critical supplies. And now the Palestinians in Gaza are lucky if even 30 trucks get through on any given day. We have thousands of trucks lined up that can't get in through the Rafah crossing. And of course, Israel's planning to launch its blitzkrieg attack there this month. And so that'll will presumably cut off any even trickles of aid that could possibly get through. So I wanted to add in here this quote from Matthew Ho, who's a frequent guest on Judging Freedom and has been a frequent guest on this show as well. And Matthew says, he said yesterday on X, keep supporting, funding, and following independent and alternative media. A new poll today shows 55% of Americans are opposed to Israel's, quote, military operations in Gaza, and only 36% support it. That's a 14-point drop in support from November. What's important is the context. The opposition to Israel's genocide comes even though most of the American corporate media and nearly all of our politicians advance a pro-Israel narrative and AIPAC approved or provided talking points. It shows that Americans are learning about the world through sources the empire can't control. It scares and frightens them. And of course, Matthew Ho was a whistleblower when he was working. He was a political officer for the State Department in Afghanistan and blew the whistle before Obama's surge, which succeeded in nothing except making the Taliban stronger, wasting probably another $1 trillion of American taxpayer money and killing tens of thousands more Afghans. And so I would like to point out one last thing. There's a disturbing poll from the Pew Research Center Ordinarily I like to take an optimistic view on all these polling figures that are coming out, but there was one, and Caitlin Johnstone wrote up a good piece about it. Very good piece called "Half of Americans Have No Idea Whether Israelis or Palestinians Are Suffering More Deaths." So the one thing that gives me a bit of pause, but I think Matthew's point is dead on, that the independent media and actually social media platforms like the much maligned TikTok and Elon Musk's Twitter, which is certainly much more of an open platform than it was before he took over, at least the way it was in the several years before that. Uh, they play a huge role in informing the American public in ways that the mainstream media refuses to do, because they are just so beholden to the Israel lobby and the American establishment, the empire, whatever you want to call it, the deep state. And so the Pew Research Center poll says most Americans report having strong emotional reactions to the Israel-Hamas war. Yet, for the most part, Americans are not paying very close attention to news about the conflict. One sign of this limited attention is that only about half of U.S. adults can correctly answer a question that tests their factual knowledge by asking whether the number of deaths in the war so far is higher among Palestinians or among Israelis. And of course, so as Caitlin says here, the answer is, of course, is many times more Palestinians have died since October 7th than Israelis. There were reportedly 1,163 Israeli deaths on October 7th, with the IDF claiming to have lost 246 troops since then in their ground offensive in Gaza, while the Gaza Health Ministry says that Palestinian deaths have exceeded 32,000, which is a massive underestimate, given the thousands and thousands of people who are buried under rubble and presumed dead or just missing. And so, of course, I think Matthew Ho's point is just so right on the money, that we need to support independent media, which is what is actually bringing this information to the American people. And like I said, these social media platforms and just regular Americans sharing information with each other. The mainstream media's job is to make it seem like this is anything approaching an even-handed fight, which of course it's not. Just before the show, Kyle and I were talking about that, about the massive power differential, where you have a state-of-the-art military, the most dominant military force besides the United States military in the Middle East, waging a war of genocide against a civilian population penned up in an open-air concentration camp, no less, under blockade by air, land, and sea since 2007, bombed, intermittently in large and medium-scale bombing campaigns, deprived of education and food and medicine and water and shelter, and made to live in rubble for years and years and years, and kept in this horrible state of impoverishment and terror. And now they're, as they kind of are happy to tell you, they're carrying out really a final solution for the Palestinians in Gaza, and they're going to kill as many as they can and kick the rest out into Egypt or wherever else they can send them. In fact, Netanyahu recently hinted that President Biden's idea for building this temporary pier off the coast of Gaza could be used to deport Palestinians rather than to bring aid into this much-needed aid into the Strip. So I think the American people are just waking up to what an absolute disaster this policy is, and how, well, Israel is just revealing to the American people exactly what it is, that it's genocidal in character, the entire Zionist project, really. And so I'm sure that we're going to see more evidence that the American people are turning against this. So keeping with that, here's the story about Anel Sheline. State Department official resigns over Biden's support for Gaza slaughter. And Dave DeCamp wrote this up for antiwar.com. It's on the page today. Came out yesterday on the 27th. So Anel Sheline, people might know, readers of antiwar.com might know, she worked for the Quincy Institute, I believe, for a couple of years. Was very, a very impressive analyst on the brutal U.S.-backed Saudi and UAE-led war on Yemen. And had been a guest numerous times on the Scott Horton show. And so she started working for the State Department about a year ago and has now resigned in protest of Biden's support for the genocide in Gaza. So, as Dave writes here, Anel Sheline, who served as a foreign affairs officer in the State Department's Bureau of Democracy, Human Rights, and Labor, has resigned from her post after a year due to President Biden's unconditional support for the Israeli slaughter of Palestinians in Gaza. For the past year, I worked for the office devoted to promoting human rights in the Middle East. I believe strongly in the mission and the important work of that office, Sheline wrote in this op-ed she penned for CNN announcing her resignation. She says, however, as a representative of a government that is directly enabling what the International Court of Justice has said could plausibly be a genocide in Gaza, such work has become almost impossible. Unable to serve an administration that enables such atrocities, I have decided to resign from my position at the Department of State, she wrote. Now, Sheline said that she did not initially intend to make her resignation public, but did so after being encouraged by colleagues within the State Department. She said, when I started to tell colleagues of my decision to resign, the response I heard repeatedly was, please speak for us, she wrote. And then in the op-ed, she cites Aaron Bushnell, the 25-year-old U.S. airman who died after lighting himself on fire outside the Israeli embassy in Washington, D.C., again in protest of Biden's support for the genocide of the Palestinians in Gaza. She said, I am haunted by the final social media post of Aaron Bushnell. And Bushnell's final social media post was, quote, many of us like to ask ourselves, what would I do if I was alive during slavery or during the Jim Crow South or apartheid? Of course, he's referring to South Africa. What would I do if my country was committing genocide? The answer is you're doing it right now. So Sheline is the third U.S. official to publicly resign over Israel's onslaught in Gaza, which has killed over, as we said, 32,000 Palestinians and more than 13,000 children. Josh Paul, who worked in the State Department's Bureau of Political Military Affairs, quit early on in the campaign back in October and criticized the U.S.'s blind support for Israel. And then Tariq Habash, a Palestinian American who worked in the education department, resigned in January. In response to Sheline's resignation, Habash told Al Jazeera that, quote, it wasn't surprising that Sheline felt like the only way she can make an impact is by leaving, because in almost 6 months, we've seen no substantive change in policy, and our influence at the international stage seems to be disintegrating by the day. Sheline said that she and other federal employees had tried to influence policy both internally and publicly, but that it failed. She said, my colleagues and I watched in horror as the administration delivered thousands of precision-guided munitions, bombs, small arms, and other lethal aid to Israel and authorized thousands more, even bypassing Congress to do so, she said. Before joining the State Department, Sheline had worked as a researcher at the Quincy Institute, where she was critical of Biden's relationship with Saudi Arabia and U.S. support for its brutal war in Yemen. Now, the White House is conducting this new bombing campaign against the Houthis, which is not supported by the Saudis, and of course, the U.S. is blocking the peace deal in Yemen with its new sanctions since they started targeting Israeli-linked shipping and this new bombing campaign led by the Americans, and then also with the British participating, as is often the case. This is what they've done. So, I mean, of course, this was a war that killed 377,000 people. That's the UN number. I believe it's a very conservative estimate from the end of 2021. Basically, they put the poorest country in the Middle East under a full air, land, and sea blockade, and then leveled all of the critical infrastructure that would sustain life. And they caused cholera epidemics. And this went on during the COVID pandemic as well. And you had, according to the UN, the vast majority of those nearly 400,000 deaths were children under 5 and infants, because those are in situations like we see in Gaza and in Yemen, or in past brutal economic wars and sanctions campaigns we've waged, as with Iraq in the 1990s. The most vulnerable populations are children. Okay, so this next story, Netanyahu is now planning to send a delegation to the U.S. for Rafah talks after he canceled the previous delegation over the U.S.'s refusal to veto this recent ceasefire resolution, which passed at the UN Security Council. So Again, Dave wrote this for antiwar.com yesterday. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu is now looking to reschedule an Israeli delegation to Washington to discuss Israel's plans to invade the southern Gaza city of Rafah, which he initially canceled in response to the U.S. not vetoing the UN Security Council resolution, which called for a ceasefire in the Strip. A U.S. official told the Times of Israel that the two sides were working to schedule the delegation, which will include Strategic Affairs Minister Ron Dermer and National Security Council Chairman Shaki Hanegbi. Dermer, an American, this is so great. Ron Dermer has previously said, just in the last weeks, that they don't care what the Americans say. They're going to launch their blitz against Rafah, where 1.5 to 1.7 million Palestinians have been forcibly displaced internally within the Strip. And this ground invasion into Rafah and an escalated bombing campaign beyond what they're already doing with daily strikes, it's probably going to result in at least thousands and thousands more casualties, and women and children and men being butchered and murdered with our munitions that we're paying for and sending over to the world's most notorious apartheid state. But more likely, you're probably going to see something like tens of thousands more people killed. And this is going to be one of the most horrific chapters in American history. It's a stain that won't wash off. And of course, the Biden administration is not going to do anything about it. In fact, Dermer, after being so disrespectful, this client state demanding everything and refusing to, do even the slightest, make even the slightest effort to follow, because Biden is a war criminal monster. He deserves to be in prison for the rest of his life. But the only thing he cares about is his electoral, future here and his chances for reelection and the political future of his administration and his party. And so that's why we see, as Kyle was mentioning on the Judges show today, they don't really care if a bunch of neo-Nazis armed with NATO weaponry are killing civilians in Russia. They would just prefer that they refrain from attacking oil facilities so much within Russia, energy facilities, because it's going to shoot up global oil prices, and that could hurt Biden's political situation here at home. The last thing you want is gas prices going through the roof, as we near the election. And so, honestly, I think that's the only thing that the Americans really care about here, or the White House, I should say. And of course, Shaki Hanegbi is a Likud member. He's a former settlement minister for Israel, which is completely illegal. The illegal settlements, the Jewish-only colonies in the West Bank, where you have about 700,000 of these settlers living in the West Bank, and they're currently constructing more and stealing more land from the Palestinians, which is only going to provoke more attacks on civilians and more ethnic cleansing and murder of children. We've already seen the deaths of the killings of children, I should say, in the West Bank shoot through the roof just since October 7th, with UNICEF saying last year was the deadliest year on record for children in the West Bank. And Hanegbi is the guy who, when Netanyahu came back to power in December of 2022, was saying that, look, Netanyahu will go to war with Iran. It's his destiny. And these are the kind of people that are being sent over here to talk to, these American officials who just have done nothing but just desecrate our name. So Dermer is former ambassador to the U.S. He's born from the United States. He recently vowed that Israel will attack Rafah regardless of what the U.S. says. And an Israeli assault on Rafah, as Dave says, is going to have a huge number of civilian casualties. Before the war, the population of the city was 275,000. And now you have 1.5 million Palestinians approximately living out there in tents with virtually no medicine or food or fuel or any kind of critical necessities, out in the rain and subject to the elements and the weather, and just constantly in fear of the strikes that are being carried out on a daily basis. And it continues to get more and more crowded. And it's just, I can't even imagine what it's like to be there right now. And so for most Palestinians in Rafah, it was the last place they could go after being displaced from everywhere else in the Strip multiple times. So Israel launched a series of airstrikes in Rafah on Wednesday this week, raising fears among the city's residents that the ground invasion was imminent. And according to Reuters, the strikes hit 4 homes and killed at least 15 people. Now, an invasion of Rafah would also disrupt aid shipments into Gaza even more, as I said. That's the only border crossing with Egypt. The U.S. has issued warnings against going through with the invasion, but there's no indication that the White House is seriously considering imposing any consequences. In fact, as Biden said in that MSNBC interview, Rafah is our red line. And then they basically asked him a follow-up question like, well, what does that mean exactly? He goes, well, no, there's no red line. I mean, I would never stop arming Israel for their missile defense, for example. Our relationship is too ironclad. And, he's desperately trying to just offer rhetorical condolences to his base, and in the meantime just making the entire United States government guilty of genocide with him leading it. And so Dermer said that Israel will go ahead with the invasion even if the rest of the world and the U.S., quote, turns on Israel. But Nimrod Schaefer, a retired IDF major general, recently said that Israel would not be able to launch a full-scale assault on Rafah without U.S. support. And he says, what do I mean when I say if the Americans tell us not to operate in Rafah, we won't fight? We won't operate in Rafah. Maybe we will carry out very small and focused missions, but we won't see anything similar to what happened in the last 5 months in Gaza if the Americans tell us not to, Schaefer said, according to the Jerusalem Post. And, the way he describes it, very small and focused missions. This is ostensibly what the White House wants to happen in Rafah. There should not be any assault on Rafah whatsoever. This is just part of the ethnic cleansing campaign. They can make all the excuses that it's the last Hamas stronghold all they want. That's not true. Hamas has reasserted itself in northern Gaza after they bombed it worse than Dresden or Hamburg. So that's just ludicrous. And U.S. intelligence and Israeli intelligence believes that this campaign is nowhere near to wiping out Hamas, and that they'll be dealing with Hamas as a terrorist threat, or whatever you want to call it, as a resistance faction within the Palestinian population for years and years from now. So this is ridiculous. But he's saying that if Biden did cut off military aid, which we've approved more than 100 arms sales to Israel since this war began, then they wouldn't be able to carry out this blitzkrieg against Rafah. Like he said, it would be a very small and focused mission. Now, I don't know if that's exactly true, but I mean, if they're reading the Jerusalem Post, then Jake Sullivan should be telling Biden, boss, we should just cut off the aid now and tell them not to invade Rafah, because otherwise you're just going to get the result. I'm just saying that you're going to get as he's saying, it would be akin to what they claim they want to see in Rafah, as opposed to something what we're going to see in Rafah, I have to imagine, is going to be up there with the worst atrocities we've seen so far in the war, and it could be worse. It's actually pretty hard to fathom. So this next story is about Lebanon, as Israel is drawing closer to war with Hezbollah along its northern border. Jason Ditz has been covering all the escalations and back and forth strikes, tit-for-tat strikes going on between Hezbollah in the south and the Israelis since the war started. So Jason wrote this yesterday. Israel attacks Lebanon Paramedics Center, killing 7. So in one of the deadliest strikes in the current round of fighting in the Lebanon border, Israel attacked a site in, forgive me for the pronunciations, but Heberai, southern Lebanon, killing at least 7 paramedics. The strike destroyed the building in Heberai that housed the Islamic Emergency and Relief Corps. The official Israeli narrative was, of course, starkly different, reporting that they'd attacked a, quote, military building and killed a significant terrorist, end quote, and several other operatives associated with the Jama'a al-Islamiyah. Locals mocked the story, saying it was plainly a lie, and that this building used by Islamic Emergency and Relief Corps paramedics was a simple civilian target that Israel chose to attack. The locals said that they believe this is part of a concerted Israeli effort to depopulate the southern part of Lebanon along the Israeli border. Now, nearly 100,000 Lebanese residents have fled the south because of the ongoing attacks. And while most of Heberai residents haven't done so yet, this overnight attack on paramedics raises the concern that their locality is now in the line of fire. So Hezbollah has responded to the attack by firing around 30 rockets against the city of Kiryat Shimona and a nearby army base in northern Israel. Many of the rockets were intercepted, though at least 3 hit their targets. One struck an industrial building in the city, killing a 25-year-old Druze from a nearby village, wounding at least one other. Hezbollah officials emphasized they intend to retaliate against the Israelis for the paramedic attack. Over the 6 months of the conflict, Jason says, Israel has repeatedly targeted paramedics and ambulances. As it did today, Israel offers a very different story about the intended target of such assaults, but the result is that being a rescue worker in southern Lebanon is to be in harm's way. I have one last story from Jason here about what's going on between Israel and Lebanon. Israel kills 9 more in South Lebanon, including more paramedics. So fears of a major escalation on the border with Lebanon and Israel continue to grow this afternoon as Israel carried out a new round of deadly attacks against border communities, killing at least 9 more people. The first strikes were against a border village of Tyre Haifa, killing 5. The identities of those killed aren't certain, although Hezbollah said 2 of its paramedics were killed in Tyre Haifa. And the attack that killed the Hezbollah paramedics was reportedly against a vehicle for the Islamic Health Organization. That wasn't the end to attacks on paramedics, as Israel followed up with more attacks on the border town of Nakora, hitting a group of paramedics near a cafeteria and killing at least 4 and wounding 6 others. Between these and the overnight strike in Hebera, which killed 7 paramedics, the death toll simply for medical rescue workers is in excess of a dozen. The Israeli attacks were presented as retaliation for a rocket attack by Hezbollah earlier in the day, which killed 1 Israeli Jew and wounded 2 others. Those rockets were themselves retaliation for the Hebera strike on the civilian paramedics. Now, Israel still hasn't discussed the killing of the paramedics in either case, presenting the first strike as the killing of a significant terrorist and his associates in a military building. And just to clarify once again, locals confirmed the building in question was host to paramedics. This is a civilian target. And throughout the past 6 months of tit-for-tat strikes between Lebanon and Israel, Tel Aviv has repeatedly attacked medical personnel, and today's actions suggest that that's only going to get worse. Ongoing efforts are being made to negotiate a border settlement that would preclude an Israeli invasion of Lebanon. Today's killings are a big setback to that, and if the war is to be avoided, nations must redouble their efforts. And as we've seen in numerous reports citing U.S. officials, the consensus within even the White House is that this campaign that Netanyahu is preparing to launch against Lebanon, he sees as key to his political survival. It's one of the reasons why we won't see. It's obviously it's not the only reason. The ethnic cleansing has to be carried through to the end, I'm sure, is the logic. But that's one of the reasons why we won't see a ceasefire in Gaza. But even if they did, as the war cabinet in Israel has made clear, that would only be used as an excuse to vastly escalate the campaign against Hezbollah. And so Netanyahu was already facing these corruption trials and had hundreds of thousands of Israelis in the street protesting against him for his corruption and his efforts to basically cripple the power of the judiciary in Israel. And now, of course, there's going to be political hell to pay for his whatever you want to call it, being asleep at the wheel, having the IDF, who should have been guarding the border with Gaza, over in the West Bank, dealing with what the settlers are carrying out because of the expansion of settlements, and of course all the trouble that Bezalel Smotrich and the Itmar Ben-Gvirs and his coalition have been causing in the West Bank. And so also, if they get to it, obviously the years and years of support for Hamas as well, in order to prevent ever having to negotiate a 2-state solution with the Palestinians, namely with Fatah, the Palestinian Authority. And so, anything he can do to stay in power, he's going to do. And of course, the Americans fear that if they'd like to be able to blame Netanyahu for the campaign and then just kind of get rid of him, and then maybe we can maintain the status quo. But as they found out whenever they talked to these other officials or potential candidates to replace him, like Benny Gantz, when he comes to Washington, he makes very clear to these officials that you can get rid of Bibi, but the policy will stay the same. We are, 100% of one mind when it comes to this campaign in Gaza, and also the mass killings going on in the West Bank, of course, and the expansion of the settlements. So, Biden's in enormous trouble here. And as I said, the next shoe to drop could be a blow up with Hezbollah and a real escalation of that conflict, which has been going on for 6 months now. It's not, this status quo won't hold It's possible that it won't hold much longer. And so, of course, if you want to keep up to date on what's going on, listen to this show and read Jason Ditz at antiwar.com.
All right. Thank you, Connor. And we will be back with more episodes next week. Our friend Misty Winston will be returning to the show early next week. So look forward to that. All right. Thank you, Connor.
Thank you, Kyle. Thank you, everybody.